They tied her wrists against the adobe wall, spat on her, ripped the feathers from her hair one by one, while four armed men laughed, and no one in that town dared even lift their eyes. That was the last thing she saw before a stranger, with no name and no flag, dismounted his horse and walked straight toward death just to save a woman he had never even met. What happened in the next 3 minutes on the streets of Janos would become the legend no history book ever dared to tell. The dust of Sonora forgives neither the living nor the dead. That Tuesday in 1790, the Presidio of Janos was a nest of vipers under a sun that fell like molten lead. A place where the law was written in blood and erased by the wind, where a man could die for stealing bread or live untouched for stealing another human being's freedom. The stranger rode into town on a bay horse, his skin weathered by years on the trail, and his eyes already witnesses to more death than any man should have to carry in a single lifetime. He wasn't looking for glory. He wasn't looking for redemption. He wasn't even looking for the warmth of a clean bed. He only wanted water for his animal and a patch of shade that wouldn't demand the price of his freedom in return. But before the sun finished sinking behind the mountains, 4 armed soldiers would learn, the hardest way possible, that this man was no ordinary shadow they could push aside from the road. That is how legends drag themselves across the desert, with no fanfare, no heralds announcing their arrival, only the rhythmic sound of hooves striking the hardened earth. With no map to guide his steps and no destiny to justify his wounds, this man was an extension of the road itself, just as silent and just as relentless. But fate, that old card sharp who always keeps an ace up his sleeve, put in front of him a scene Janos had already repeated 1,000 times, though it never stopped being a direct insult to heaven. Against the adobe wall of the cantina, a young Apache woman was cornered, her back pressed to the dry mud, as if trying to melt into the earth itself to disappear from that hell. 4 men surrounded her, closing the circle with the cruel patience of coyotes who know their prey has already run out of strength. The air in that alley weighed more than lead, thick with the smell of old leather, rancid manure, and that unmistakable metallic stench that always precedes violence. The woman did not scream, and that absolute silence was the first sign that her spirit was a fortress no rope could ever tear down. Her name was Nalin, of Chiricahua blood. Her eyes were as deep as a dry well, yet they still held the oldest secrets of the mountains. She wore a deerskin tunic, blackened by the journey and the abuse, and 3 braided eagle feathers danced in her hair with a dry breeze that seemed to mock her captivity. Her hands, empty of steel but full of purpose, clutched a leather pouch against her chest as if her own heart beat inside it. The men harassing her were not simple road bandits, but soldados de cuera, hardened mercenaries in service of the crown, men who saw in every Apache either a cash bounty or a hunting trophy. At the head of the group stood Velasco, a captain whose scar split his eyebrow in 2 and whose badge of authority was nothing but a mask hiding an absolute moral rot. "The order is clear," Velasco bellowed, his voice dragging out each word as if his vocal cords were made of ice. "You stole cattle from the Sanchez family, and here, woman, that is paid for with forced labor or with your skin." It was a crude lie, one of those legal fictions the powerful manufacture on the frontier to feed the engine of slavery disguised as justice. Nalin had never touched another man's cattle in her life. She had come down from the sacred peaks of the Sierra Madre for one reason only: to search for her little brother, a boy who had been sold months earlier at one of those infamous Indian auctions in the Presidio's main square. Her only sin was existing in a land that wanted her dead, yet paradoxically needed the strength of her hands to keep functioning. The stranger stopped exactly 10 paces away, dropping his horse's reins with a calm more threatening than any shout. He knew this breed of men well, the type who only felt like giants when facing someone the system had already condemned in advance, parasites who used the uniform as a shield to hide the insatiable hunger of their own mediocre souls. Mateo, the name the stranger rarely spoke aloud, adjusted his hat and took a firm step toward the center of the conflict. The sound of his spurs against the hardened earth cut through the tension with the precision of a scalpel. Velasco didn't turn around right away. He was too busy savoring the terror he thought he saw in the slight tremble of Nalin's hands. "Keep walking, gringo. This isn't your business," spat Goyo, a thin soldier with a shifty gaze who nervously rested his hand on the pommel of his saber. Mateo didn't stop. His eyes stayed fixed on Nalin, reading her posture, recognizing in her that fierce dignity cowards so often mistake for defeat. "The woman isn't going anywhere with you," Mateo said. His voice wasn't a shout, but a low murmur carrying all the weight of an irrevocable death sentence. The four soldiers tensed in unison, like violin strings about to snap. Velasco turned slowly, flashing a yellowed grin that never reached his hate-filled eyes. "And who the hell do you think you are, interrupting the king's sacred justice in this presidio?" he asked, his irony dripping pure venom. "I'm a man who knows how to read both the law's fine print and the souls of the cowards who twist it," Mateo answered without flinching. He pulled out a cigar, lit it with a slowness that infuriated everyone watching, and exhaled a cloud of gray smoke into a cobalt-blue sky that felt almost insulting in its calm. Janos, in the year of our Lord 1790, was a boiling cauldron of prejudice and caste laws that decided who deserved air and who deserved the noose, based on nothing more than the color of their skin. It was a border territory where civilization was barely a chipped coat of varnish over a foundation of absolute human brutality. From the shadows of the doorways, the townspeople watched with hunched shoulders and eyes fixed on the ground, not daring to intervene, because knowing you were next on Velasco's list meant a certain sentence to oblivion or an unmarked grave. But Mateo did not belong to that town. He was a remnant of the border wars, a man who had seen peace treaties used for nothing more than wrapping corpses. "Touch her and die," Mateo whispered again. No one understood the true weight of those 4 words until the first shot rang out. The silence that followed was so thick even the wind seemed to hold its breath to hear how it would end. Velasco let out a dry laugh that sounded like breaking bones, but his right hand quietly dropped toward the grip of his heavy flintlock pistol. 4 against 1, stranger. The math of survival isn't on your side today," the captain declared. "I've survived far worse odds than these because lead can't count," Mateo replied without blinking. In his mind, he had already dissected every opponent's movement with a surgeon's cold precision. Velasco made his move. He was fast for his age and weight, but Mateo was a force of nature. The first blast didn't come from the stranger's revolver, but from Goyo's carbine, its bullet whistling past Mateo's ear to bury itself in a rotting wooden beam. Mateo drew his weapon in a single motion, a rare and lethal piece for those latitudes, and fired once with surgical precision. The round caught Rico in the shoulder, throwing him back into the dust before he could even take aim. The gunshot was deafening in the narrow street, multiplying in echoes off the adobe walls. Black powder bit into the air, and for an instant no one knew whether they were breathing dust, smoke, or pure terror. In the blink of an eye, Mateo read Goyo's fear, Rico's slowness, and young Diego's hesitation. Velasco was different. Velasco actually knew how to kill, and that's why he had to fall first. The street remained still, but something in the air had shifted. It no longer smelled only of fear, but of gunpowder waiting for a spark. Nalin took a step backward. Her eyes met Mateo's for one fleeting instant, and in that microsecond there was no plea for help, only a mutual recognition of the storm about to break over both of them. Goyo desperately tried to reload his weapon, but Mateo had already lunged at him, striking him with the butt of his gun with a mechanical efficiency that wasted not a single ounce of energy. Diego, the youngest soldier, stood frozen with his saber halfway drawn, his eyes wide with horror as he watched his companions fall one after another. Velasco managed to fire his pistol once, but the thick cloud of black powder blurred his aim, and the bullet only tore through Mateo's wool poncho. The stranger remained standing, impassive and cold as the marble of a forgotten tomb in the desert. The system, for all its supposed omnipotence, had crumbled in a matter of seconds in the face of one man's will, a man who did not fear death. Mateo lowered his weapon slowly, but his fingers never left the trigger. He looked at Nalin with an almost imperceptible nod and gestured toward where his bay horse waited. "Time to go. This air smells too rotten," he said with an unsettling calm. Nalin didn't need to be told twice. They walked together down the Presidio's main street under the stunned gaze of an entire town that had just watched systemic fear defeated by gunpowder and one man's courage. They left Janos as the sun began its agonizing descent, staining the surrounding mountains a violent red, as if the earth itself were bleeding alongside them. He walked with a firm stride toward Velasco while the captain frantically searched for a knife hidden in his right boot. Mateo gave him no chance and pressed the hot barrel of his gun against his forehead, right where the scar began. "Order your men to fall back, or this town will finally have a captain with an honest hole in his head," Mateo declared. Velasco, cold sweat soaking the back of his neck and his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged animal, raised his hands in surrender. "Back off! Drop your weapons! Leave him!" he shouted at the two soldiers still able to move. Rico groaned on the ground, uselessly trying to stop the bleeding from his shoulder with his dirty fingers. Goyo lay unconscious in the dust, his jaw knocked out of place. Diego simply let his saber fall to the ground and stepped back with his hands raised, crying from pure helplessness and relief. They rode for leagues and leagues until the Presidio became nothing more than a blurred memory on the horizon. For a long time, neither spoke. Only the beat of hooves and the horses' tired breathing filled the silence between them. They made camp near a dying stream that still held a thin thread of clear water among the scorched stones. Nalin lit a small, discreet fire, using techniques her people had perfected over thousands of years to avoid detection. Her hands did not tremble, but her eyes still carried the fire of what had happened in Janos. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried the weight of mountain stone. She told Mateo of her brother's tragedy, the unchecked greed of the landowners, and the criminal complicity of the Spanish officials. She told him of the peace settlements, a policy designed to tame the Apache through alcohol and dependence on rotten rations of meat. "They give us poison in bottles and scraps of cattle so we'll forget the names of our ancestors and the freedom of the peaks," she said, a bitterness that seemed to scorch the very air. "But the spirit of a Chiricahua does not feed on the crumbs that fall from the oppressor's table." Nalin nodded, her eyes reflecting the sacred fire. "You're not like the other men in uniform. You have eyes that see beyond the shadows," she told him. "I'm just a man who got tired of hearing lies dressed up as laws. Nothing more than that," he answered with genuine humility. They spent the night beneath a blanket of stars that looked like cold diamonds nailed into the black velvet of the sky. At the break of dawn, Nalin prepared to continue her journey north, toward the mines where rumor said her brother still survived. Mateo listened in silence as he meticulously cleaned the powder residue from his gun. He too carried his own scars, some visible on his skin, others burned into his conscience. He had served as an officer on the Florida frontier before corruption and hypocrisy forced him to desert a cause he no longer believed in. He had watched peace treaties signed with one hand while the other held the whip of slavery. Prejudice isn't something you wear like a piece of clothing, Mateo reflected, watching the dance of the flames. It's a poison a man chooses to drink willingly, so he never has to face the emptiness of his own inner weakness. Mateo handed her a small pouch of silver coins and a finely crafted Toledo steel knife. "Find your people, Nalin. The desert is vast and cruel, but it can't hide the trail of blood forever," he advised her. She studied him for a long moment, trying to decipher the mystery of a man who had risked his life for a stranger in a land that despised her for the mere fact of being born. "Why did you really do it?" she asked, genuinely curious. Mateo mounted his bay horse and gathered the reins with steady hands. "Because in a world full of people saying yes to injustice, someone has to have the decency to say no," he answered simply. Nalin disappeared into the creosote and mesquite brush, moving with the grace of a shadow returning to its ancestral home. Mateo turned his horse west, toward the rising sun beginning once again to warm the earth at his back. Janos would not remain, at least not for a while, a place of unjust laws and men driven by the lowest greed. That morning, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner. The legend of the stranger who defied the soldados de Cuera for the dignity of an Apache woman would begin to whisper around campfires and be told in hushed voices in the plazas, a story of how the power of an oppressive system shatters the moment it meets a single individual who cannot be bought or bent by fear. And this is where this chronicle leaves us with a lesson that resonates with brutal force, even in our modern times. We often make the mistake of blaming institutions, governments, or abstract laws exclusively for the injustices we see every day, but laws have no hands to strike, no eyes to discriminate, no hearts to hate. It is the human beings who carry them out who decide, in every single act, whether the system will be a shield protecting the weak or a hammer crushing the oppressed. The prejudice of the men of Janos did not live in their leather uniforms, but in their conscious decision to see Nalin as an object to be traded rather than a human being with a soul of her own. Mateo didn't save that woman out of some burst of Christian charity. He saved her because he recognized in her the same spark of freedom he had spent his whole life fighting to preserve in his own chest. At the end of the day, justice isn't something graciously handed down to us from above. It's something we must be willing to defend with our bare hands in the middle of the street, in broad daylight. True courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the conviction that something matters more than our own safety, our dignity. If this story left your pulse still racing, imagine what it feels like to actually be there, in the middle of the dust, when the next stranger crosses the border into another town condemned by the same injustice. That story is already on its way. And trust me, this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Don't miss it. Hit like right now before you forget. Comment which corner of the world you're watching this from, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of this saga, because the desert still holds many more legends waiting to come to light.